This series of videos is going to take you through setting up provisioning in Sonar. There's a few different steps to take, and depending on what method of provisioning you're using today, this is going to be implemented differently, but I'll show you each option and how they interact, and then we can make a good choice about how to set up your network. I'm going to start by configuring our IP addresses in here. If we go to Network and then IPAM interface, IPAM being our IP address management interface, we can begin by setting up some supernets and subnets and pools. So you can see I already have some set up in here. We'll add a couple more so I can show you how it works. But I have 3 supernets here today, and a supernet is the largest contiguous subnet you have. So here I have a /12, here I have a /8 and a /24, which I've named infrastructure management, customer private space, and public space. If we open one of these up, for example, if I open up customer private space, you can see I have 2 subnets inside here. One's a /24, one's a /22. And you'll see this colored bar over to the right that shows me just at a brief glance how much space I have left in each one of those subnets. If I open up this one that's almost empty, my first subnet, you'll see I have a pool in here, which is what's consuming most of the space. And the pool goes from .2 to .254. So a pool is a way of defining a range of IPs that's given out in some kind of pool-based mechanism. So for example, if you're using Dhcp, you'd have a pool of addresses you're assigning to users. Maybe if you're using PPPoE, you have a pool of addresses you're giving out by PPPoE. That's what a pool's for. See, I have another one configured in here. Let's add another supernet in here just so you can see how that works. I'm going to come in here and we'll say this is for, I don't know, servers. So I can set up a supernet here, which I'm just putting in some private space for. Once I've created my supernet, which has no subnets in it right now, I can add a subnet. So I'll call this, say, servers in rack 1. So I'm breaking this down into a smaller subnet at this point. And I can either pick what I want the subnet to be, or I can do it in an automatic mode where I say, I want to break this down into a /28. I need to pick the type of subnet this is. Is it for customer equipment, infrastructure? Is it a mix, or is it reserved? Reserved being, I want to put these IPs aside for now. I'm just blocking this off. So it's not going to be used today, but I don't want anyone else to take it. Since this is for servers, I'm going to pick infrastructure. And then the network site that this subnet's going to be deployed at, I only have one right now, so I'm going to pick that. Now here's my subnet, and if I wanted to, I could create a pool within this subnet. So hopefully this makes sense. Really, all you're going to do in here to get started is come in, add your supernets, break them down into subnets where appropriate, and then create pools within those subnets for any pools of IPs that you're going to assign to your customers. Okay, so we got some space set up in here. Let's talk about a couple of other high-level concepts. To do provisioning in Sonar, we have 2 main ways, and you can layer these together. You can use them in tandem or you can use them independently. But these methods are to use an inline device. So an inline device would be a device that sits in your network in line with customer traffic and does some kind of management. It might be shaping, it might be filtering, it might be redirection, but it does something to that customer traffic. The other way we can do it is with radius. So if we were doing something like PPPoE, for example, we could add a radius server in here and we could create radius groups and we could put users into those groups. Or we could use these together. We could be using radius to do PPPoE. We may also have an inline device, some kind of DPI device like a Procera that we're using to do some kind of policy enforcement on users that are authenticated by radius. So let's just take a quick look at what we can do with both of these things. If you have an inline device, what we do is we create address lists to group those users. And in creating those address lists, we will create a representation of that list on the inline device that we can use to group those users together. So let me show you a really quick example here. When we go to the address list page, we can create some address lists. And an address list is just a grouping of IP addresses for customers that meet a specific criteria. For example, let's say we wanted to create a group of users on our inline device for every customer that's delinquent. So I could create an address list called delinquent. I can say I only want this to apply to accounts that are delinquent, and save. And now all of my delinquent customers will be put into a group on my inline device called delinquent. And I'll show you this a little later on when we get into configuring some actual inline devices, but just want you to see the concept today. Let's say we had one called active customers. Can say only apply this to accounts with an active status. I need to not have a space in here. And then I can create that. And now we have one called active customers. Now we also have this option down here for relationships. This lets you get a lot more specific. So you can see right now I have an option to include specific account statuses or types. But we can also include groups and services. So let's just make a couple really quick so you can see that. If we had a group and we called it, say we had one for copyright infringers. So every time I get a DMCA notice, I want to put my customers in this group and I'm going to do something to them. Maybe I'm going to redirect them to a page and say, we got an infringement notice, you need to accept this agreement, or maybe I want to rate limit them or block them from peer-to-peer connections or something, right? So let's also create a service. So I'm going to call this my internet service. Costs $50 a month. This is a data service, delivering it by fiber. It's 5 megs down, 1 meg up. And you can see I have an option here to create an address list for this service at the same time I create it, but I'm not going to do that because I want to create it by hand. Okay, so let's go back to our address lists. And now let's create one, and we're going to call this copyright infringers. Don't care what status the customer is, I don't care if they're delinquent or not, but if they're in my group called copyright infringers, I want them to be put in this address list. And then let's make that service one finally. So we'll call this my internet service. And if you have this internet service, you're going to be put into an address list called internet service. Now I could tie these together. I could say, I only want you to go into this group. Maybe I want to make one for just my residential customers because I want to do some kind of prioritization on them on the network differently. Maybe I only want customers in an active status or with a generally active status, right? Here I'm picking specifically the account status called active. Here I'm saying put any account in here that has a status that is active. So let's do that. Let's make this residential one. Okay, so here's my address list. So here's what would happen if we had this in a live network today. If we had some kind of inline device, like a Procera or a router or some other kind of device inline, right now we would have found all of our active customers and put them in a group on that device called active customers. I would have found all my delinquent customers and put them in a group on that device called delinquent. And then we go into that device and we can use that group to do something, like impose some kind of shaping policy or redirect them or whatever I want to do. And again, we'll go through some real-world examples of that a little later, but just want you to understand how these work. Let's take a look at our other option, which is radius groups. So if I was doing radius, one of the things you can do in radius is create groups and have reply attributes for those groups. And this works in almost the same way as our address lists. Very similar. So let's make some of the same kind of groups here. Let's say we wanted one for active customers. I want them to be active. And here I can set a priority. In radius you can have a priority on a group, and radius will run through these groups in order of priority. Don't worry if this doesn't make a lot of sense to you right now. If you're using radius, you probably understand this already, and we'll dig into this a little later too. But I'm going to make this high priority, and I have this option to say fall through enabled. And if I have fall through enabled, this means on the radius server will keep running through groups, even if it hit one that I match. So I'm going to turn that on for now. The other thing that we have with radius groups is the ability to set up some reply attributes. So this is a core concept of radius. When you authenticate with a radius server, you have certain attributes that are sent back, and the device that's requesting the radius authentication will do something with those attributes. So let's say, for example, in my active group, I'm going to have an attribute, and I'm going to call it is this customer active, and it's going to be equal to yes. And I can add more of these, right? So we can create as many attributes as we want. Let's make one more really quick. Let's make one for my internet service. We'll do residential just like my last one. So they have to be residential and they have to have internet service. And then we're going to come in here and we're going to say, let's say we were using MikroTik. Believe they have some kind of rate limit attribute. I don't remember the exact format, but you can look this up. But let's say it's 5,000 by 1,000 is what gets returned. Okay, so you can see by creating these groups, we can automatically create groups on a Radius server. And this works really the same kind of way as the address lists. What I'm doing when I create a group is I'm saying, find customers that meet these criteria on the Radius server, put them into this group, and then write these reply attributes for the group. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, the last thing we're going to look at in this video, in this kind of pre-setup, is our Dhcp servers. So an option that we have in here is to set up Dhcp to give out IPs for our users. So I can come in here and add a Dhcp server, and I can associate this with pools in my IPAM if I want to. So let's add one in here real quick. I'm going to use a MikroTik as my Dhcp server. I'm going to call this Dhcp server. I'm going to put in the IP on my network this runs on. Is this authoritative for every pool that I've created, or am I going to have specific pools I'm going to associate this with? I'm going to associate this with specific pools, so I'm not going to check controls all pools. And I need to put in a username and password for API access to my MikroTik. So let's save that. Okay, so we've gone through a little bit of the IPAM, we've talked about setting up some IPs, and we've talked about high-level concepts on how address lists work, how radius groups work, and then we've set up this Dhcp server. So in the next video, we're going to go a little bit more into some of these provisioning concepts, talk about how we're actually going to add some IPs on the customer account so that we can start putting them into these address lists and radius groups, and then we'll move on with doing some actual configuration on the inline devices to implement some policy.